Do you ever wonder how taxes were collected in ancient times? What about the Middle Ages? And how does that compare to taxes today? When you think of taxes during ancient times, you're probably thinking of them as harsh and overbearing. You're probably imagining farmers and peasants where most of their produce is being taken away by a corrupt tax collector, leaving them with the bare minimum. But what if I told you that the reality was different? The truth is, in modern times, we pay more in taxes today than our ancestors ever did centuries ago. In fact, what we consider as normal tax rate here in the Western world would probably be considered as oppressive by farmers and peasants in medieval times. So let's talk about it. Let's take a deep dive into how taxes worked over time and how taxes helped shape history. Let's start all the way back. Ancient times, even before ancient Rome or Greece. You see, for most of recorded history, taxes weren't actually paid with money. Rather, it was paid in kind either through labor or produce. You see, in ancient Egypt, most people were required to work for around 2 or 3 months for the state on various projects. And this included not just the pyramids, but irrigation canals, roadways, and other infrastructure projects. And these laborers were paid in rations for their time. And there's actually some anecdotal evidence that if their rations weren't enough, they would actually go on strike and rebel. So anyway, in later societies that weren't as centralized and didn't have an established market economy, taxes didn't really play that much of a role. It played a relatively minor role. Let's look at ancient Greece for instance. Only the very richest were taxed. By the way, I made a video about how paying higher taxes was actually considered a badge of honor in ancient Greece. So check that video out over here if you haven't already. Also, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We've made loads of videos about topics like taxation, bankruptcy in medieval times, topics like the Great Depression, and much more. So check it out. Anyway, in ancient Greece, for the average Joe, taxes were actually kept as low as possible, and regular taxation was almost unheard of. People were given the right to reject taxes if they believed that someone wealthier than themselves were not being taxed enough. And the taxes that were collected were used to pay for costly projects like wars, great temples, and constructing warships and so on. Now, compared to the Greeks, the Romans were quite harsh for their time. After all, maintaining a massive standing army and empire-wide infrastructure wasn't cheap. Nevertheless, until later in the empire, even their taxation could be considered mild by today's standards. Sales tax was kept at 1%. Property tax ranged from 1 to 3% and was only imposed during times of war. Inheritance tax, however, was taxed at a high 10%, but even then, close relatives of the deceased were exempt. Now compare that to modern times, the tax rates were actually quite low. Alright, let's move on to the medieval times now. Now towards the end of the Roman Empire, taxes started to get harsher. And this was why the invading Germans were actually welcomed by the locals. You see, the German tribes were known to be intensely opposed to taxation. Now during medieval times, most taxes were collected either in kind or indirectly, pretty similar to what we talked about in the ancient world. And this would include indirect taxes, and they were things like transit duties and market fees. For peasants, or people in the lower class, taxes were being collected in kind as opposed to being collected in cash. And they usually only had to worry about one type of tax being collected, which was called the tithe. And this was 10% of the produce that they made or the labor that they committed, and it was paid to their local minister or church, not to some big central government. But if they held land, they were also subjected to additional land tax. But the land tax was generally lower, around 2%. Okay, so these tax rates sound pretty appealing, don't they? But it's important to keep things in context. Life wasn't great back then just because taxes were low. Just remember that we're talking about medieval times here, so conditions weren't always so nice. Also, low tax rate wasn't a continuous long-term situation for medieval folks. For instance, any newly conquered land generally resulted in a pretty steep rise in taxation. In 1363, for instance, when the Germans invaded Sweden and installed a German king, records showed that the tax burden, which was paid in butter by the way, went from 16 kilograms per year to a staggering 162 kilograms of butter. That's more than 10 times increase in taxes. Another example is from Egypt when the Arabs conquered it in 642 AD. The Arab governors instructed to milk the camel even if it stops giving milk but instead gives blood. Keep milking until the blood runs dry. Now, that sounds pretty harsh, and it's not a very common thing during those times. I'm talking about some really extreme examples here. The taxation burden began to increase as the ages progressed, and this was mainly because wars were becoming more costlier. Governments and kingdoms were spending more behind standing armies. For instance, the English actually introduced the poll, or a head tax, in 1377 to fund its war against France. Many Italian and German city-states also introduced various direct taxes, including the first income tax over time. Here's a fun fact though, there was no separate body that assessed taxes on your wealth or income. Rather, you had to assess it yourself and take an oath before the civic commission that your assessment was honest. And in some instances, I'm pretty sure some people took advantage of that situation. Anyway, let's move on to modern times. The state's need to collect taxes to fund wars would create a positive feedback loop over time. More taxes made the state stronger, for sure, but a stronger state meant that they could impose even more taxes. Naturally, rebellions and revolutions were bound to happen. That's why we have the American Revolution and the French Revolution as the most famous examples. And some not so famous examples also came from heavy taxation for wars. The biggest peasant-led rebellion ever in Europe occurred in 1525, and you guessed it, taxation was the cause. Now, as we move on through time, we'll see that taxation and tax policies continue to evolve, and in some instances, we can see some tangible benefits. For instance, in some societies, you will see that they become heavily taxed. However, you'll see that while taxes increase, the ratio of tax revenue to national income also starts to increase, so one could make an argument that higher taxes actually helps a country. But you see, it's not always very simple, because by far, the biggest tax increases would occur between world wars, to fund wars. It's interesting to note that many tax measures were actually implemented during times of wars as temporary measures. However, even as the wars ended, they remained in place. Since the world wars, technically, our world has been in relative peace, and the logic is that with fewer wars, support for high taxation would also begin to decline. And proponents of taxation today would say that lower taxation actually hurts public services. But the other side of that argument is that it's not the lower taxes that's the problem, it's the misappropriation of tax funds that's at fault. You see, higher taxation won't solve what at heart is an accountability problem. Taxes need to be spent for the benefit of the general public, rather than the benefit of a few powerful companies and for bailouts and things like that. Otherwise, higher taxes would only breed resentment across the general population, and those with means would always try to dodge responsibilities. Were things better during medieval ages and ancient times where taxes were in kind and not directly based on income? Sure, but how were living conditions back then? How was access to healthcare, access to education back then? You see, it's not as simple as saying that taxes were lower, that's why times were better. I think it's important to understand how taxes actually shaped history. The basic idea has always been that the general public provides some income to their governments, and in return, they get protection and benefits. It's a simple enough idea. However, the complexities with corporations, governments, and policies have made taxation a very nuanced and complicated subject. If you enjoyed this video, you'll enjoy this one that I made about how taxes worked in ancient Greece. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.